Good afternoon. I hope you enjoyed your first session. They were very inspiring. I hope you learned something there, and I want to introduce us to the next session. I am Ruth Barr, and I'm the Associate Dean for the Office of Graduate Studies for the University of South Florida, with its main campus in Tampa. Under the USF, under the leadership of Kiri Kilpatrick and Brandis Baines-Weiss, have served on the host committee for this important event. We've enjoyed working and serving NPA in this capacity. I now have the opportunity to introduce you to our first plenary speaker, Joshua Weiss. As you will see, his credentials are quite impressive. He is the co-founder, along with William Ury, of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard University and a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. He is also the director and creator of the Masters of Science degree in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University. He received his doctorate from the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University in 2002. Dr. Weiss has spoken and published on negotiation, mediation, and systemic approaches to dealing with conflict. In his current capacity, he conducts research, consults with many different types of organizations, delivers negotiation and mediation trainings and courses, and engages in negotiation and mediation at the organizational, corporate, government, and international levels. Weiss's most recent book, called Trouble at the Watering Hole: The Adventures of Emo and Chicky, is geared toward children and designed to teach them negotiation skills through a story format. The book is for 5 to 10-year-olds. The next book in this series will be published in 2018. Weiss is the creator of a number of innovative products that use the power of present-day technology to convey negotiation to a broad audience. In addition to teaching numerous synchronous and asynchronous courses and trainings over the web, he has developed 2 products of note. The first is the Negotiation Tip of the Week, NTOW, which is a podcast. The second is Negotiator in You audiobook and ebook series. The Negotiator in You series was published in January 2012 and was in the iTunes top audiobook category for 2 months. The NTOW was in the top 100 iTunes business product podcasts from 2007 to 2010 and was downloaded over 2 million times. In addition to this series of The Negotiator in You, specifically for salespeople, was published in January of 2013. Finally, Weiss has conducted trainings and consulted with a number of organizations, companies, and governmental entities, including Microsoft, General Motors, United Auto Workers, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Publishing Company, Novellus, Christie's Art Auction House, CDM Smith, Genzyme, Harvard University, Yale Medical School, multiple departments in the United Nations, the State Department and Transportation Security Administration of the U.S. government, and various state organizations. It was great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Joshua Weiss.
Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to be with you. Thank you for the lovely introduction, maybe a little long, but not so necessary. But I also know that I'm standing between you and lunch, which is never the ideal spot here, but I'll do my best to try to keep you engaged and finish on time so I don't wreck expectations. So I was asked to come and talk to you a little bit about negotiation, and I know many of you do this as part of your job. Anytime, I take kind of a broad view of negotiation. Many people tend to think of negotiation when it comes to salaries or contracts, but to me, anytime you start engaging with another person and there's a problem, a challenge, something you need to work through, you're negotiating. So this is a life skill, and unfortunately, not a lot of people are comfortable with it. There was an informal study done on LinkedIn of 8,500 people, and 37% of men and 26% of women said they were comfortable negotiating. So if we flip that around, it means an awful lot of people who really aren't. So part of the challenge is, why is that? Why is this such a challenging process for us? And so I have a few answers for that, and I also want to sort of challenge a little bit of your notions of what it means to negotiate. Because a lot of this is rooted in you. So one of the things that I say to my students when they start my program is half of your challenges in negotiation are out there with the people you deal with, the dynamics, and things along those lines. And the other half are actually in you. How many of you have negotiated with yourselves? If you're not raising your hand, you're not being truthful, okay? We all have, and we talk ourselves, how many of you talked yourself out of having a conversation, right? If your hand isn't up, sorry, but you're not telling the truth again. So the point is that we do a lot of this in our minds, and we have to start to think, why is that? Why do I feel like if I were to say, can we discuss that the world is going to come to an end? Because it's not. And so part of what I want to do with you today is help you to understand some of this and think about it. Now, the master's degree program that I run is 2 years, and I say to my students at the end of it, you're now ready to negotiate. Okay, so I have 45 minutes, right? So just by way of expectations, we're going to touch on some things. Hopefully, I will spark a few things of interest for you to kind of keep learning a little bit. But this is, to be an effective negotiator, is a journey. It is not a destination. You never get there. You always are improving. You're always learning. I've been doing this 30 years, and I still have those moments where I only figure something out afterwards. And that's because I'm dealing with other humans, and they don't do what it is that I would like them to do. So it's a process that requires a lot of humility, but it also requires a sense that, yeah, I can solve this problem. I can deal with this issue, which sometimes people think are contradictory, but I don't think so. I think you can do both at the same time. So let me just share with you there we go. So as I was preparing for this, I was looking around for some examples, and I found this terrific example in a chat thread. And I don't know if you can read it, so let me go ahead and read it to you. So this is coming from an individual, and I will tell you that he does a lot of really great preparation in his mind. He's thinking through a lot of excellent things and excellent points when it comes to negotiation. And then I'll share with you what happened at the end. So he starts out by saying he was offered a postdoc that was funded through a federal fellowship program. The lab has a lot of grants. He could negotiate the start date. The PI indicated that if he was to pick an earlier date, might not be enough time for the fellowship paperwork to go through, but the lab had some resources to cover salary for the first few months. Okay, so he's thinking these pieces through. Then he says it's relevant because I know the PI and the lab have money that they can allocate to payroll, right? So he wants to negotiate as a matter of principle. Perfect. You should, right? He's got some experience. He negotiated his graduate school offer with success. So he finds out that the federal fellowship is actually a pretty competitive rate. And then he starts thinking about state taxes. And if he moves, there would be a little more expensive, and he's not sure about health costs, but doing the kind of preparation you want to do, right? So then he gets to the end here, and I say, wait for it. He says, so is it unwise to negotiate this offer given that it's competitive and more than I've expected? The PI has so far been extremely kind and reasonable. Okay, what happened to all that we just did? Right? He's beginning to talk his way out of this. But I don't know if attempting to negotiate violates some sort of protocol and might start things off on the wrong foot. Does it violate some protocol? I don't think so. So this is what I see with a lot of people who hesitate to negotiate is they do the hard work. They think through all of this, and then all of a sudden they get to that point where they're about to ask, and they think, I can't do it. I think somehow I'm going to offend somebody, okay? So this is a familiar story, and part of what I'm wanting to help you think about is why. Why is this the way that you approach these situations? And I would guess if I were to ask you individually, do you approach other situations like this? Most of you would probably say no. Is that right? I'll take it as a yes that that's right. Okay. So why don't you negotiate? Well, the first thing is the fear of conflict, right? Most people don't like conflict. Not only, or to put it differently, they are fearful of it. Because for most of us, when we think about conflict, we think about negative. If I were to ask you a word that goes along with conflict, it would be something like anxiety, anger, frustration, right? But if I were to tell you, actually, that conflict serves a purpose, and I know you're probably thinking I'm quite weird to say that, but it's true, because the problem that a conflict is surfacing exists. And if you don't address it, it still exists. It's not going anywhere. So it's actually, when a conflict arises, it's bringing something up that's already there and that you have to deal with, okay? So part of it is thinking, can I reimagine conflict as actually something that is not so fearful, but actually something that is highlighting an issue that needs to get addressed, okay? That's the first thing. So the second is the fear of sort of the employer's power. Now, power is a funny thing. It's a very funny thing when it comes to negotiation because power is an interdependent process in negotiation. Now, yes, it's true that an employer has the ability to hire you, and they do hold power. But, you know, one of the things that I often say to people when we're talking about power in negotiation is, why are they sitting with you? Why are you there? Like, if they have so much power, why don't they just dictate everything and then you go and move on? The reason you're there is because you bring some value and you have some worth and you have something that they want. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother sitting with you, right? So power is a little different in negotiation than it is in general. And I'll get into that. I'm going to give you a few tips for how do you try to manage a power differential. They're real, but if you view power as an absolute, it's debilitating. Then you're just hoping they'll throw you some crumbs as opposed to actually negotiating differently. And then there's sort of the fear of negotiating poorly. How many of you have had any sort of introduction in any way to negotiation? Okay, that's more than I thought. Most people haven't. And so the process itself is anxiety producing. They think, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to negotiate effectively. I did see it on a TV show once, or it was in the newspaper that, you know, I'm supposed to try to humiliate the other person as much as I can and then we'll get somewhere, right? So that's not it, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about what are a couple of key skills that you can use in your negotiations that will help you. And I view negotiation in general as a problem-solving process. And if you can get to that point, even something as simple as that, you're much further down the road than other people. Because when you see it that way, you say, okay, so now we have a problem to solve. So let's think about how we do that, as opposed to digging in and thinking someone's going to win here, someone's going to lose, and someone's going to take advantage of the other, right? So why should you negotiate? So most employers and folks involved in negotiation are open to offers. Some employers might offer less because they actually expect you to negotiate. So if their offer is low, instead of being offended, maybe think, well, maybe they're expecting me to come back with a counter proposal. All employers and PIs and others, they want you to come in happy. They don't want you to come in feeling beaten up, right? Because is that good for them? No. You don't want to start a new endeavor limping along, feeling like, oh, I really got taken advantage of, and now, you know, do I really want to do this? And that's not the mindset that people want you to come into something with, right? But only about 25% of applicants to most things actually negotiate. And the reality is, from my point of view, and I'm actually working on a book right now of real-world negotiations that highlight the ability for people to meet their needs, that there are a lot more negotiations out there where mutual gain happens than one person winning over the other. Because the reality in negotiation is that there's an interdependence between people, and you're not going to say yes if things don't meet your interests and needs, and neither are they. So there's a lot of opportunity to think, how do we get there? How do we make this happen? And remember, if you receive an offer, they want you, okay? A lot of this is, again, that talking to yourself and reminding yourself that you bring something to the table here, something quite important. So I think it's fair to say that one of the most important rules in negotiation is, and one of my friends at Harvard had this on his door, that if you ask and you hear no, you feel stupid in the moment, or maybe for 5 minutes. But if you don't ask, you feel stupid the rest of your life. And I really think that that's true. And people are not mind readers. They don't know what you want. You have to communicate clearly, in fact, maybe more clearly than you think. I'm one of those people who thinks actually that communication should have been called miscommunication, because rarely do you really get what it is that I'm telling you. And so if you don't ask, people don't know. And you've got to get your head around that and realize, hey, okay, well, what do I have to lose? and not what you can conjure up in your mind to lose, but really. And this is where one of the things that I do a lot in negotiation is I have colleagues that I use as sort of negotiation buddies. And I'll go to them and I'll say, listen, so I'm preparing for this. Do you think it's realistic that they would say, no, go away? And usually they're like, no, why would they say that? They want to work with you, whatever, right? But having an outsider who you can bounce ideas off of and challenge some of those things that you conjure up in your mind is incredibly valuable. So find a negotiation buddy or somebody who's not involved in your situation that can offer that perspective. It's very valuable. So for the rest of the time here, I just want to tell you where we're going. So I want to talk to you about something that's quite important in negotiation. It's called the difference between positions and interests. And if you can just do this one thing, it will help you greatly in negotiation. And then I want to talk to you about getting creative, okay? To me, negotiation is not about compromise. In fact, compromise is a lazy way to negotiate. And probably a lot of people are like, huh? What do you mean? I thought that's what you did in negotiation. And actually, you don't. Because if you compromise quickly, then you fail to actually explore for what it is that people really want and need. And you never look for creative solutions that might actually benefit you more. So I often tell my students, resist the urge to compromise. You can always do that later. Like, that's the last stop on the train, not the first one. Get creative. Think about this as a problem and a difficult challenge that you can solve if you work it. And the people that I work with at Harvard and elsewhere who are the best negotiators that I know, when they go down a road and it's blocked, the negotiation's not over. That was one road. It's a little bit like, how many of you play chess? Anybody? A few people? It's a little bit like preparing for chess. When you play chess, if you have one strategy, you're in very big trouble. Like, you can't do it that way because the other player's not, again, going down the road you want. But if you plan in a contingency way that says, okay, I'm going to try this, and if that doesn't work, then I have these 3 avenues that I can go down. And that gives you sort of confidence that if something's blocked, you don't say, okay, well, I tried to negotiate and it didn't work. No, you didn't try to negotiate. You have to really be tenacious when it comes to solving a problem. So I'll talk more about how do you get creative a little bit. And then I'll give you 4 ideas for if you do have to deal with power, and it's fair to say that with your PIs and others who you're negotiating with, you're going to have to do that. I'll give you 4 ideas of how do you try to manage that a little bit better. It is absolutely a challenge, but it can be done, okay? So in terms of positions and interests, so think about an iceberg, okay? In negotiation, we get what we would call positions, which are what people say they want, okay? Interests are why they want those things. They're all the motivations, the needs, the reasons why. And when you think back to some of your negotiations, most of our negotiations stay at that tip of the iceberg level, the positional level. Well, I want you to do this. Well, I don't want to do that. Okay, that's a positional level. And the tip of the iceberg, for those of you who don't know much about icebergs, is about 10% that's poking through the surface, which means that 90% is underneath there, right? And that really does mirror negotiation because there's so much stuff going on under the surface. And your job in negotiation is a bit like an investigator, is to figure out what's going on here. What is really driving and motivating you and then them, okay? Because I do a reasonable amount of consulting with people, and I'll sit with them and I'll say, what are you trying to achieve here? And they'll say, it would be nice to have that, and it'd be great to have this. I'm like, that's not what I asked you. I'm like, what is your objective? Like, what are you really aiming for? So you have to start with yourself and get clarity about what are the things that are really important to you and maybe less important to you in this process. And then on the flip side, with the other, you have to understand them because they're the ones that need to say yes, right? So interests are interesting in that they're both tangible and intangible. And it's the intangibles, the psychological pieces that make us human, right? The need for identity and self-respect and things like that that drive a lot of negotiation processes. In fact, I would say to you of all of the scenarios that I've seen, it's the intangible issues that are much more at play than the tangible. If someone feels disrespected, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at them. It's not going to work. So you've got to understand what's going on there for them and think that through, right? So when it comes to your interests, start with what is it that you want exactly, and be really specific, not vague and general. It would be nice to have this or that, but what do you want, and why is that so important? What's your logic and rationale, okay? And one of the mistakes that people make in negotiations is they tend to think in sort of just singular things. But most of us want lots of things. There are a lot of things that we value. And when we talk about value in negotiation, we don't just mean money, we mean what's important to somebody. And I'm going to give you a couple examples and have you jump in here and help me. But then rank out your interests, okay? So think to yourself, okay, this is really the critical thing that I want. And rank them out, because when you do that, then you begin to have a way of saying, well, I really don't want to let go of this interest that's so fundamentally important, but some of these others, if I'm asked, maybe that's okay, right? And can the other person really meet your interests? You know, sometimes we're asking things of the other person that they can't actually do. And if you know, when we get to the end of this process and you've thought about this, can you really assert effectively for your interests? And if you think no, why not? Do you feel like you don't deserve them? There are a lot of people who feel like the other person is entitled to their interests, but they feel guilty when it's theirs, right? So ask, and this is where you have to talk to yourself and say, why is it that I think or feel that way about this? And talk yourself out of that, because you should. I mean, you don't think that about the other person, so you shouldn't think it about yourself. So when you think about in your negotiations that you engage in, what are the things that you value? So just throw out a few here for me. Obviously, resources, money is one, but what else is important? What's that? What's that?
Autonomy.
One more time? Autonomy, yeah, okay, right, absolutely. What else? Vacation, okay, of course. Flexibility, right? I have 3 daughters. To me, if I can, figure out a way to not have a nanny and pick them up and do those kinds of things, that matters, right? Benefits, yeah.
Standardizing, getting out each day on time.
Okay, so some kind of specific schedule, that especially if you've got other commitments that you need to know, right? Yes? Maternity, right, okay. 1 or 2 more? Community, right? So what's it like to work here? And am I on my own, off in some little distant corner, or are there actually people there to work with? Yes, 1 more, sir.
Protected career development time.
Okay, so protected career development time. So what you begin to understand is there's a lot of things to negotiate in these processes, but yet most of us, when we go into our negotiations, we don't tend to think that way, right? We tend to think much more narrow. And so what I'm asking you to do is think broadly here. What are all those things that you could ask for that in many ways probably don't cost the other side anything? That flexibility, for example, for some, it's not a problem for you to come in and do other things, or telecommuting, or whatever it might be, right? If you work in a part of the country where there's a lot of traffic, like I do in Boston, that telecommuting is really valuable, right? So broaden your sense of what's important. And then you have to flip things around and sort of think about what their interests are. And I would tell you this, by the way, that if you were to say to the other negotiator, I tried to give a little bit of thought to what's important to you. Can you think of a more disarming comment than that? No. And in fact, I have seen other negotiators' whole sort of aura change. They were like, you did? Why would you do that? Like, that's my job. I'm like, well, no, actually. Like, I need to understand what matters to you, because we're kind of in this together. See, I see negotiation, that person to me is my problem-solving partner. The issues that we're dealing with are the problem, not them. I need them. There's a great story. So one of my colleagues at Harvard, a guy named Roger Fisher, used to tell a story. He's a very interesting guy. He wrote a book called Getting to Yes, which some of you may have heard of. And he tells a story of these 2 fighter pilots who were training to go off to World War II. And they had been training for 3 months, and they were basically doing the same thing. Every day they would go up, and they would turn off one engine to simulate an engine getting shot out, and could they fly a plane that way. Right? So that after 3 months of doing the same thing, the pilot looks at the co-pilot, and he says, we've been doing this a very long time. It's getting really boring. We need to shake it up a little. And the co-pilot was kind of a man of few words, shrugged, and said, okay. So the pilot says, you know what we've never done? We've never shut off one engine and then shut the other one off, because it could happen. We could lose power. We could, it could start to fail. Again, co-pilot sort of shrugs. Pilot goes, I'm doing it. So the pilot's flying along, shuts off the first engine. They're flying along. The first engine, he shuts off the second one, and they start to plummet to Earth, as you would expect, with gravity and all, right? And the pilot can't get either engine started. And the co-pilot looks at him and goes, boy, do you have a problem. And that is the challenge in negotiation. Have you ever had somebody say to you, you know what, that's your problem. When you figure it out, get back to me. I'm like, no, actually, that's actually not how this works from my point of view. Like, you and I are in this together, and the sooner you get it, the better off we'll be. Because, like I said, we're both bringing something to the table. So part of this is empathy, right? So Carl Rogers said empathy is non-judgmentally entering somebody else's world. Not easy. It's not easy to judgmentally enter people's world, let alone non-judgmentally. But it's imperative that you do it, and not tangentially, but really empathize with somebody. What constraints do they have? How difficult is it for them to do X, Y, and Z, right? And there's a guy named Chris Voss. Some of you may have heard him. He's a former FBI negotiator. He wrote a book called Never Split the Difference. And in the book, he talks about something called tactical empathy, which is that you empathize with the other side so that they will kind of empathize with you and feel for you. So if you hear from them an emotion behind what they're saying, repeating back that emotion disarms them and helps them. It makes them want to actually meet your interests, okay? And sometimes I think we try to outsmart ourselves a little bit when it comes to the questions that we ask to try to get at these interests. So simple questions like, why is that really important to you? You've mentioned this, but I'm not sure I understand why that matters, right? Or is there some kind of underlying concern here that I'm hearing from you? Or what's the real problem? Like, again, I'm hearing something, but I don't know exactly what it is. And really important to confirm what it is they've said, because I've been in a process where I said something and the other person said, oh, you want this. I'm like, that's not what I said at all, actually. So really important to make sure that you take the time and say, so wait, this is what you're looking for, correct? Like, that's what matters to you, et cetera. So let me share a story with you. So I had the privilege of working on a project in the Middle East for 10 years, and it took me to 5 different countries. And one of the stories that I learned when I was there is this is my favorite one. So the story goes that there was once a king who had 3 sons. And when he died, he left them 17 camels. And to the first son, he left half of the camels. To the second son, he left 1/3 of the camels. And to the third son, he left 1/9 of the camels. Now, unfortunately, 17 doesn't divide out evenly for all of you math whizzes out there. It took me a while to figure this out. So they went to a wise old woman and they said, what are we going to do? We need some help here. Like, we got to figure this out. So when I put this to people, I get some interesting responses. Some people say, chop the camels up so that we can spread them around. I'm like, camels don't work well when they're chopped up, so I don't know if that's a great idea. Sell all the camels, okay, that's a possibility. Do the sons really want the camels, right? Well, the wise old woman said, look, I'm not sure how to help you, but I have a camel, and if you want it, you can have it. So now they had 18, and so the first son got half of 18, which was 9. Second got 1/3 of 18, which was 6, and the third got 1/9, which was 2. So 9 plus 6 is 15, plus 2 is 17, and they said, oh, great, here's your camelback, wise lady. So what I want you to think about in your negotiations, especially when they look like they can't be solved, is where is the 18th camel? And you're going to sit there in the room, and you're going to be thinking that, or if God forbid you blurt it out and say, where's the 18th camel here? The people are going to think you're crazy. But I want you to look and I want you to think creatively about your situation. And how do I solve this? Sometimes it means thinking, is there another way we can bring other resources to bear? Is there another way we can bring other people into this issue? And sometimes it requires stepping away. Now, one of the things that happens a lot in negotiation is that we make our biggest mistakes in the moment. And there's a logical reason for that, because a lot of us, again, as I said, we feel anxiety and pressure in negotiation. And so when we're put on the spot, which is often how we feel in negotiation, we still revert to our instincts, or fight or flight instincts, right? And I'm not a scientist, as you probably gathered, but I do know that when you get into fight or flight mode, the blood in your body goes to your core and then to your extremities so you can fight or flee, right? So there's a problem with that, right? Problem is there's no blood flowing to your brain, so you're not thinking clearly, which is actually why we make those mistakes. Has anybody ever said to you, I'm not sure why I said that? And as much as you would like to think it's an excuse, it's actually not. It's true. There was nothing going on there, so they just threw out the first thing that came out. Point being that in negotiation, if you're not sure where to take things, it's okay to say, you know what, can I just take a break for a minute and think about where we're going or what I'd like to do here? Or let me get a coffee and try to figure this out. I will tell you that I almost never give an answer pro or con in the moment anymore. Because what I've seen when I sleep on something, if I take even an hour to step away, I begin to see the pros and cons of an idea much more clearly. And people have said to me, well, okay, but you can't always do that. I say, you're right, 99.9% of the time I can do it. The 0.1% I can't. And all you have to do is say, you know what, I'd really like to think about this. I'll get back to you tomorrow, or whatever it might be, unless there's a real reason that you need to decide right now. Sometimes it happens, but more often than not, you don't have to. And it's done as a way to pressure you to do something you don't want. So put some distance and space between yourself and a decision. It's only going to help you in the long run, okay? So let me give you a quick scenario, sort of like I asked you about what else do you value. So just imagine for a minute that a employee walks into her boss's office and asks for a raise, and the boss says, sorry, we're already over budget for the year, right? Let's imagine that the reason the employee is asking for a raise is not money. So what else could the employee want? What else could be the motivator? So I just want you at your table for 1 minute. Let's take 1 minute instead of 2. Just brainstorm what else could be driving this person to be asking for a raise short of money. Go. Okay, about 15 more seconds. All right, so what'd you come up with? Just give me a couple. Throw them up here. What'd you cut? What's that? Gender pay gap. Absolutely. What else? What's that? Raising their profile, okay. Status, that they're doing the same work as others, right? Recruitment, okay. Can you say another word about that?
They're being recruited by somebody else.
Got it.
Like this job.
Yep, okay, all right. Yep, you got another offer, okay. I'm sorry, say that again? Additional resources, okay. Lack of feeling appreciated, right? Back to some of those intangibles. Yes? Okay, some kind of family change. Yep, yes, in the back. Couldn't, job security. Yeah, okay. And that sort of feeling of value, being valued and being wanted, et cetera. Okay, one more. Okay, right. So maybe some of you have taken on work and not been paid, and you think that's not quite reasonable or fair. Okay, I lied. One more. Okay. You want, right, okay, so you want to begin to influence their thinking. Right, okay, good. So in part, you see what can happen with this stuff, right? Which is that if you view negotiation, first of all, assumptions wreak havoc on negotiation. They're sort of the silent killers of good negotiation processes because people make them all the time. So the boss here is assuming right away, well, they want money and I don't have it, right? So pause on your assumptions and ask questions. Like that's one of the best things you can do in negotiation is not jump to a conclusion, not make assumptions, but say, well, help me understand that some more. Like why? Why does that matter? Play the why game. It's useful. But here you have 10 different possible reasons why they could be asking, right? So this negotiation doesn't have to end this way. It could end differently. If you get down and say, well, tell me more about why you think a raise is reasonable, right? And that's going to lead you down a road of, okay, well, because I'm doing more work than I should, I took this on and I was never compensated. Or you know, all these 4 people are doing the same thing as me and they're all senior and I'm junior, right? Okay, so you can kind of get the idea there. Now, when you don't have power in negotiation, it feels a little bit like this, okay? We happen to find these penguins in the wild who are doing this, and this is not doctored in any way. So I'm going to leave it for one more slap or two, and then I have to shut off because it's one of those things where if I leave it, it kind of gets funnier as you watch it, right? So, okay, so and like I said, I'm not diminishing the notion that power exists in negotiation. It does, right? But it's not as debilitating as you think it is. And so I want to give you a few ideas. If you are a weaker party in a negotiation, what can you do? What can you try? Right? What are some things that you can bring to the table? So the first one is really sort of considering timing. Okay, timing has a significant impact on negotiation. And as Ben Franklin reminds us, necessity never made a good bargain. So the more you need something, the more pressure you feel. This is why if you get attached to a house that you want to buy, you're in big trouble because you're going to pay more, right? So try not to get as attached as you would like to things. But timing matters a lot, right? If a PI needs to get somebody in because their funding starts soon, well, they're going to have to be more flexible, right, in what they do. So you want to think about timing and think about, do I have any control over timing? And when to raise things. You know, I had a student who was a nursing student, and she said, you know, she took my class, and she said, you know, I really want to go and talk to my boss about a raise. I said, okay, good. And we prepared and whatever. And she called me, and she's like, it didn't work. And I said, well, what happened? She's like, well, I went in, and I said, do you have a minute to talk about something? And he said, yeah, I've got a minute, but I've got a meeting in 10 minutes that I've got to get to. She's like, okay, great. I'm like, no, what do you mean, okay, great? You shouldn't have gone in then. Because he wasn't focused on you. He was focused on this meeting, and you have 10 minutes, which can't really get you anywhere. So the timing was not right. You should have recognized it and said, okay, well, you know what? I probably need more time than that, so can we schedule a time, right? So think about timing. Think about, is there a way for me to utilize this in a manner that will help me to kind of and analyze from their point of view, what does timing look like? Is there pressure on them? Do they need to act, et cetera? Okay, that's going to vary from situation to situation, but you want to think about timing because timing is one of those things that can equalize power a little bit. Okay. Now, the second idea, and probably the most useful one I can offer you when it comes to how do you deal with power as a weaker party, is something that we call a BATNA. And it's an acronym for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. And really, all that means is, what are you going to do if you cannot reach agreement? So what are you we often call this a walk-away alternative as well. So what are you going to walk away to, okay? So if you see our little hiker man there, you come to a fork in the road in any negotiation where you're either going to reach agreement with them or you're going to exercise your BATNA and walk away. And you cannot negotiate effectively unless you understand what your BATNA is. Okay? And on the flip side, you also need to understand what's the BATNA of the other person. Right? Now, BATNAs change over time. So if you're sitting with a PI and you're negotiating, yes, they have more power, so they have a stronger BATNA. Right? But imagine that you might want to be negotiating for a renewal. Right? Well, has that changed at all? I would say so. Having run a nonprofit for 10 years, when I had a good employee, they had a lot more power than they realized. I did not want them to go because I know how hard it is to get a good employee, right? So thinking about that and realizing that some of that changes. You know, if you're working with a PI on on a project and you're doing a great job and you're working really well together, do you really think they want you to walk away? No, they really don't. So the balance of power is changing. And it's important to understand. Now, sometimes you don't have a good BATNA. And it's important to understand that and to think, is there a way that I can improve my BATNA? And there's an example of how to improve your BATNA that I came across. A colleague of mine shared it with me recently, and it was really quite interesting. So he was working with a company. It's a little different context, but I want you to just get the idea that you can actually try to improve your BATNA in these situations. So he was working with a company that had to buy some machinery from another company in China. And it was the only company in China that made this equipment. So it was a sole supplier negotiation, which for people on the other end of that negotiation, that's not a good place to be, right? Like, they're your only option in the whole country of China. Yikes, right? So they called him in and they said, look, well, here's the problem. We don't know what to do. What do? We don't have a BATNA. Like, there is no BATNA. There's nowhere else for us to get this. So he said, okay, look, I get it, and here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you 3 days to do it. He said, I want you to imagine that that sole supplier does not exist. And they're like, okay. He said, I want you to come up with ways that you would still meet your interest. How are you going to do that? It's gone, so now what, right? You could throw your hands up and say our business is doomed, or what? So they started down a road of thinking of different ideas, and one idea they came up with was to research companies that had previously bought that equipment from the sole supplier, and to go to them and ask them if they would be interested in selling their used equipment or something like that. And it turned out, they found 5 or 6, and one of them had changed their business model and no longer needed the equipment, the sort of specialized equipment, right? So now they had a BATNA, and they had something, and they wanted to sell it, right? So they went back to the sole supplier and negotiated completely differently, and they let them know, not to hit them over the head with it, but they let them know, hey, we do have another way to kind of meet this need. Like, it's not our preference is to buy it from you, but at a reasonable price, because the sole supplier was ready to sort of rake them over the coals, if you will. And they reached a reasonable agreement because they had thought and spent time thinking, what do I do? How do I cultivate my BATNA? Now, in your context, it may be, what are the multiple postdocs that I can apply for so that all my eggs aren't in one basket, right? Something like that. So you've got others that are out there. But as I said, when it comes to, say, salary negotiations, the first time around, yes, there's a power imbalance. But BATNAs change over time, and if you're thinking about a renewal or something like that, realize the value you bring to the table and ask yourself, if I were to leave, what would happen here? Things along those lines. And to think, what's the BATNA of the PI, right? Whether that's in the middle of a project or down the road, okay? So BATNA is a very useful concept, and it's one of those things that you can't really answer the question, did I get a good deal in negotiation, unless you know compared to what? And your BATNA is compared to what? So you always have to do that, whether it's buying a car, a house, a salary, whatever. And you want to think, BATNAs are not static. They are things that you can, sort of develop better ones if you work at the preparation phase. And I didn't mention much about preparation yet, but let me just say that, negotiation is a bit like taking tests. When you walk into a room and you have not studied, you're not going to do so well, right? Well, negotiation is the same thing. If you walk in and think that you're just going to intuit your way through it, which is what a lot of people do in negotiation, you're in trouble. The people that I work with who are really good at this stuff, if I say to them, so you have 100%, break it down for me in terms of preparation, the actual negotiation, and implementation. They would say 75% in the preparation is the amount of time I spend preparing, then probably 15% in the actual negotiation, and 10% in the implementation. So much of this is done up front, and through research, and through investigating, and through talking to contacts. Whatever resources you can bring to bear will help you in your negotiations, and you need to invest the time. If you aren't prepared, don't go in the room. Find a way to buy some time, because it isn't going to go well. I can tell you now. Okay. So another way that you can try to manage power is to try to frame the negotiation the way you want to frame it, okay? So negotiations and what you're going to negotiate about is negotiable, okay? So think about it that way. It's really important that, there isn't sort of this concrete thing that says, okay, this is the negotiation. I often will go into a negotiation and say, okay, so let's just talk about what we're negotiating about. And they're like, wait, what? Don't you know? I thought you knew. I said, I know why I'm here, but I want to know why you're here, and then I want to talk about all of these other issues that I want to bring to the table. And they're like, oh, okay. So the point is that you can framing is, a very valuable tool and skill when it comes to negotiation. Because if I can frame, for example, a scenario as protecting you against a loss as opposed to a gain, you're more likely to say yes to it. Okay? It's not manipulation, it's framing. I'm framing a problem for you, and we all do this every day. Thinking about how you say something to somebody is as important as what you're saying. Okay? So when you frame a negotiation, you can also anchor a negotiation. So anchoring a negotiation is sort of just like an anchoring a boat. You're sort of dropping an anchor here and saying, these are the parameters under which I want to negotiate. And setting the agenda, people often don't pay much attention to that. But if I send you an email and I say, here's what I'd like to talk about. Here are the 5 things I want to talk about in this negotiation. I just set the agenda for what we're going to discuss. It's not nearly as benign as it seems. So think carefully about, how do I do this strategically? How do I sort of take control of the process, even though maybe I have no right to do that whatsoever, right? And whether I have the right to do it or not is, who knows? I mean, who gives that right anyways, right? So the point is that that's one way of steering the conversation toward the things that you have, that you can impact, okay? So the last tool that you have when you're the weaker party is persuasion. So if I were to ask you, are you persuasive? How many of you would say yes? Okay, so here's the thing. So we all live with ourselves 24/7, so we actually all think we're very persuasive. Okay, and some of us are, and some of us aren't, but we all are capable of being persuasive. Most of us, when we think about persuading people, we probably think, I want to try to make sure I understand what's important to them, but I got to logically create a case for them, right? I'm going to lay this out and they'll get it. Okay, yes and no. So there's more to persuading than that. So I assume most of you have heard of Aristotle. He came up with this 2,300 years ago, so I stole it, just to be very clear. And he talked about 3 means of persuasion in his work on rhetoric. And most of us tend to only focus on logos. So logos is logic, right? And how am I going to create that logical case? And by the way, one of the mistakes we make when we do deploy logos is that we often do it from our point of view and not theirs, which is lovely, except that they're the ones that we're trying to persuade. So our point of view isn't really that helpful. So get into their head and think logically what's going to make sense to them. Right? So that's the first thing. But there's 2 other pieces to this that are really important, and I would imagine come into play in your negotiations with PIs. The first one is ethos and credibility. Okay, so I've worked in academia for a while, and there's plenty of ethos to go around. Okay? And credibility, so one of the first projects I ever worked on at Harvard, I just had my master's, and I was working with some faculty, and there was one person who was like, I'm not listening to you. And I was working on this full time, and they were sort of, and I thought, okay, I'm not sure what to do. And then I realized, okay, this is a messenger problem, right? It's not what I'm saying, it's that I'm not the right messenger. I'm not the right person to deliver this. So when I sort of came to that realization, I went to another faculty member who was involved in the project, and I said, listen, I know you and I are working well together. I kind of need you to share this with this other faculty member. Do you agree, first of all? I'm not trying to tell you to share something you don't agree with, but more, do you agree? And if you do, would you be willing to sort of make the case instead of me? And that's how the project unfolded, because I said, sure, makes sense, and you're working on this full time. We're sort of sitting at this 64,000-foot view, so I very much trust your advice. And he said, I'm happy to kind of advocate a bit for you. And what I was doing was recognizing I was not the right messenger, and that I didn't have the credibility necessary to get that across. So instead of being frustrated by that and ranting, I found a way to sort of make this happen through the person that did have credibility. Right? So part of that is asking yourself, what's the credibility you bring to the table, and how do you enhance that? How do you work with it? And more to the point as well, you know the other person that you're dealing with is probably in some way, shape, or form persuaded by credibility and things like that. So how do you appeal to that part of them as part of this process? Now, the other piece of this that most of us don't focus on is pathos. And pathos is the emotional connection that we can create with somebody. So as you all know, if you've worked with people who you trust, who you have a relationship with, right, your negotiations, your ability to deal with things get much better. So using pathos, using sort of that emotional connection, using stories to kind of trigger within them the possibility of something is really valuable. So if you can use all of these, right, instead of you using just data and facts, can I find a story that exemplifies what it is I'm trying to get across? In fact, the reason I'm writing this book about real-world negotiation stories is because it's so much more powerful than me standing and talking about theory, right? So a well-placed story is one of the best ways to persuade people. You don't even have to say anything other than the story and just leave it there, right? So think about each one of these things, and in fact, if you're listening carefully to the other, they will tell you what's most important out of these. They'll allude to the fact that, I don't know how I would make that case to my boss. Okay, so now we have a logic problem, right? So now I need to help them connect the dots and understand where they might be running into a problem with their boss. Or, you know, like I said, maybe there's an ethos kind of deal. So think about each one of these as a way of connecting the dots and making your case as persuasively as possible. And I will say one last thing before I stop and take questions. There's a very interesting book written by a guy named Robert Cialdini. So he wrote a book called Influence many years ago, but he recently just came out with a book called Persuasion. And the whole point of persuasion, as he puts it, is it's sort of like tilling soil, right? Like you don't just throw seeds on the ground and expect things to grow. You have to till the soil and work it a little bit, right? So he talks about like helping people to get to a place where you can more easily persuade them. And he says a lot of this is very subtle. So for example, one of the examples he uses in his book, which I find fascinating, so there's a furniture store, and on their website, when they had their background as fluffy clouds and they asked people, what's most important to you when you're buying a couch or a sofa, they would say comfort. And then when they changed the background to pennies and then they asked them, they would say money. And by the way, this happens to us all the time. Like most of you are falling prey to this without really realizing it, okay? Point is that there are ways in which we can try to persuade people if we really start to think, what are these tools that I have at my disposal? Of course, you don't want to cross any ethical lines, but you want to be clear that these are things that you can do to kind of balance the power involved, okay? So let me just ask if there are any questions. I don't know how we're doing. Oh, I guess we're a little late here. Are we okay to take a few questions? Yes? Okay. So yes, please. A story you might tell. Sure. So, I mean, and I'll just give the example in part of the one that I told you with regard to the company in China. Right? So that's a story of how that negotiation unfolded. If I tried to explain to you that you can improve your BATNA, you'd go, okay, I guess, I understand, right? But because I'm sharing this story that now connects for you, it's much easier for you to understand, right? And in fact, and relate to something like that. Does that help? I mean, there's some that can evoke more emotion, right? Yeah, so you can absolutely share if there's a personal story of how you got there, of why this is so important to you. You know, sometimes people are afraid to bring those things into the conversation, and you shouldn't be. You know, one of the things I've found when it comes to negotiation is if you try not to be who you are, it really isn't going to work. Like, there's no cookie cutter model for this. You have to be you. And as long as you're aware of the dynamics that go into negotiation, so much of negotiation is awareness. And if you're aware of ways in which people are trying to manipulate you or other aspects of the process, you don't have to worry so much about what other people do. And even as simple as being very clear about your objective, like I always either write across the top of my computer screen or my notepad or whatever, my objective. And so I can always just look at that and say, okay, so is what they're offering gonna meet that or not? And if it isn't, I know what the answer is. And it doesn't matter if they sit me in a little chair and, with the sun blazing in my eyes, because that's what people do. So all of those things don't matter if you know that that's what happens and those are some possibilities. Okay? Yes? Yep.
There's a lot of
There's a mic right next to there.
Oh,
there you go.
it is. Sorry, thank you.
That's okay.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah.
Katie Flint Im from Stony Brook University. Could you comment on some of the literature out there about underrepresented groups and negotiation? So, for example, we've seen a lot about how women may not be putting themselves in a good position if they bother to negotiate at all from the start. And anecdotally, I've certainly seen some of that also be true with lower-powered individuals like postdocs of PIs, having that actually sour your relationship with someone if someone would, quote, deign, unquote, to actually negotiate with you over some of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that there are challenges. And in fact, I mean, if you take something like Sheryl Sandberg's book, right, about leaning in, and the message was, in many ways, was the right message. The problem is that the message was operating in a social construction of gender, and what does that mean? And for example, if you've been working in a certain realm for 10 years and you've been, say, more of an accommodating personality, and then you read Lean In and you think, okay, I'm gonna be more assertive, the other person that you're negotiating with doesn't know the new you is coming and doesn't know what to do about it. And in part, so there's an element of sort of how do I help the other person understand that something is changing and like I'm no longer willing to accept what it is that I've accepted. But I think there's also this larger social construction, right? That if women advocate, they're seen as pushy and other kinds of things, where if men do, okay, they're just asserting for themselves. So part of that is to recognize that and be aware of it. And if you see some of that coming up, you may have to address it directly and say, look, this is as important for me as it is for anybody else. And yes, I mean, there are other dynamics at play that are there and that go on in a lot of ways in people's minds, and they influence the process. There's a colleague of mine, a woman named Debbie Kolb, wrote a book called The Shadow Negotiation, and in that book she talks about how in every negotiation there's the thing that you're negotiating about, budgets or money or whatever, but there's also this relationship, the shadow negotiation, which is that you're always negotiating this relationship, and there's different pieces to it. And so it unfolds at different levels and in different ways. So I would recommend taking a look at that for the kind of groups that you're talking about, because she tries to address how do you try to do both of those in a way that's effective. Okay? Yes, please.
Along a similar line, the BATNA seems like a very powerful negotiation technique, and I was wondering on how to bring that up and discuss it in such a way that's not seen as confrontational or abrupt or something like that.
Yeah. So it's a good question and an important one because it can often be seen as a threat, right? So I tend to try to bring it up as sort of a natural consequence, that like my preference is to reach an agreement with you or, to kind of get somewhere. But I just want you to know, like, if that doesn't happen, there are things that I can do. It's, like I said, it's not my preference, but like I'm also not without options or ways of managing this. And it's a little bit, the way that I try to describe it, it's a little bit like the difference between a warning and a threat, right? So a threat is if you were to say to your son, Johnny, or a warning is if you go out in the street, Johnny, you're gonna get hit by a car. A threat is, Johnny, if you go out in the street, I'll hit you with my car, right? So it comes across very differently, and it's important because, letting somebody know, again, this is the communication process, right? They may do their analysis and think, this person has nothing. I have them over a barrel, I can do whatever I want. So in some ways, just saying, hey, and you don't have to go into details. Just say, look, I really like to work something through with you. This is my preference, but, there are a few of these other things out there. Something is general, just to give them that signal. Yeah, let me take, go ahead, sorry.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I found that very enlightening, and thank you very much for your talk. You talked about that we often have a chance to negotiate, but we don't see it or we don't realize it, and I feel like most of us consider negotiating something that is often related to high stakes. Something is like, if I go there, it might like challenge
Right.
my job or whatever. So, but you also talked about awareness, and that actually we have a lot of negotiation opportunities every day, and we don't realize it because we feel like this is this high stake thing that happens once a year. So I was wondering whether you could give a few very concrete tips how to become aware of the chances we have in negotiating every day and every moment, and in low stake environments, and how we can train our negotiation muscle in these circumstances to be ready for the moments when actually things are at stake.
So I guess in part what I would say is that you should go into your everyday environment thinking about your interactions with your colleagues, with people who are at your level or a supervisor as negotiations. So if somebody says something and you don't agree, you're now negotiating. So just see your world as sort of this laboratory to experiment with negotiation. And the reality is that if you do that, you get more and more comfortable with it. And you realize that, okay, so we're now just having a conversation, and we don't agree, which is okay, like that happens between people. And to sort of kind of focus your attention there and say, okay, all right, so let's see. See, part of the challenge is that people spend a lot of time focused on blame and who's to blame for this problem, which doesn't really help. It doesn't get you anywhere. And it certainly doesn't help you to solve the problem. So for me, like I started out being a bit more accommodating. And what I learned is, okay, so we now have this problem, let's deal with this problem. And when you get into problem solving mode, then it begins to shift the conversation. You say, okay, so you disagree, let's talk about why, and let's see if we can find some way forward, right? So I think in many ways, like this is something that we're all very capable of doing. I mean, how do you flex this muscle a little bit? How do you keep learning? I mean, all you have to do is Google negotiation, and you will find more information that you would ever want to know. But there are good books out there. I would start, if you haven't read Getting to Yes, it was written in 1981, and it's still on the bestseller list, so they're really happy. But it's also changed the landscape of negotiation because it's sort of, there are two models in negotiation, just very briefly. One is a more positional, a more haggling, bargaining kind of way of negotiating. And then there's this interest-based approach, which is what they lay out in Getting to Yes. And when people learn that model of negotiating, it feels much more comfortable. It feels like that's a negotiation that I can do. And it's not, it's not like when I go, say, to a car dealer and the salesman is my best friend, and the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain is the person who's doing all kinds of stuff that I don't really understand, et cetera, right? That model feels very uncertain, uncomfortable. We don't like that, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, like the model of positional negotiation really can only be used in one-off negotiations. So if you're buying a car or a house or something like that. But even when you're buying a car, I have a friend who has a car dealership, and he said, I don't actually make much money from selling cars. He's like, I make it from service. So if people leave here feeling like they were manipulated, I just shot myself in the foot. Like it doesn't make sense anymore to do things like that. And so this interest-based way of negotiating enables you to do something that's really important, which is to meet your short-term interests, but not at the expense of the long-term relationship. And that is the balancing act in negotiation, because if you think of your negotiations, they're typically with the same people over and over again. You can think of some exceptions, but most people say 90% of my negotiations look like that. So if I take advantage of you, if I manipulate you, right? Well, now we have no trust at all, so this is going to be a fun next negotiation, right? Because it doesn't get you anywhere. So, okay.
Hi, this
Hi.
is Lisa from Gladstone Institute in San Francisco. I had a question about the structure of a negotiation. So it's mostly a discussion between two people. How do you, if you come into the discussion as the lower power one, how do you get some structure in there about your interest, their interest, the BATNA, maybe a story? Like, how do you structure that and able to keep the structure while talking? How do you do that?
Yeah, and I would probably go, the best tool that I know to do that is really that framing and agenda setting. That's your best way of trying to set things up and trying to stay with it. And a lot of people will go along because they don't really realize that that's actually having an impact on the process. And I don't think you're manipulating anything at all. I think what you're doing is saying, here are the places that I want to negotiate, that I feel like I can negotiate. And these are the things I want to talk about. You're not saying to them, well, you can't add a list of things that you want to discuss, right? So that, to me, is the best way, and to kind of, keep referring back to it. Use that as your framework for the negotiation. Does that help? Okay. Any other? I think we have time for. Do we have time for one or two more? Yeah, sir.
Came over quickly. So I can use an example from my own personal negotiation. So it was essentially asking for a raise, and I employed logos, obviously citing essentially merit-based reasons why, and then the counter was, well, hands are tied, and you are essentially getting what other postdocs at your position are getting. So then I employed pathos, which then failed even more miserably, because then I was encountered with something that I have never experienced before my postdoc, which is that you should be happy with what you're making because you're making more than I did, or you have more than I had. So it made me feel that I was actually greedy, and that I was asking for way too much, and also made me question now what balance I have with my PI. So essentially, all negotiations had failed at that point, and I actually ended up admitting that I was focusing too much on money. So he wordsmithed his way around this whole thing. So anyways, are there any resources that you're aware of where there are potential scenarios of counter offers that we can read to know, like, to expect, and what might be a viable strategy to counter the counter? That makes sense.
Sure. So I mentioned this notion of anchoring, and anchoring often comes along with this idea of first offers, that when you make a first offer, the negotiation tends to get anchored around that conversation. So if I just put out salary, then that's what we tend to talk about. Whereas if I lay out 5 or 6 things as part of a process that would be of value to me, then I've now anchored things in that way. The key when somebody sort of puts a frame on the negotiation is not to buy into the frame, is to counter anchor, essentially, is to kind of say, well, okay, I understand that, and yet these other things are also really important to me as part of the process. I mean, honestly, I think in your scenario, I think there was some of that was coming from him, but I think some of that was also sort of a little bit of your internalizing some of this and maybe thinking, should I be feeling guilty about this, et cetera. And we can talk more about it after. But I think in some way, the way that I best know to counter is, first of all, recognizing that when someone puts something out there, it doesn't mean that's the negotiation. It means that, okay, well, that's your take on this. Here are the things that I really need to have as part of this conversation. So I'm basically either reframing the conversation or I'm counter-anchoring and sort of saying, so for example, if somebody were to say to you, hey, $50,000 is more than reasonable for this position, or whatever it is, I don't know, okay? But you've done your research, and you say, well, wait a minute, based on these independent measures, like, this is actually what I've found. So how do I reconcile that, right? And this is where the preparation piece comes in, because if there's an industry standard, if there's an objective measure that you can point to that says, hey, I can appreciate that when you were doing this, this was more than reasonable, but times have changed a little. Sometimes apples to apples isn't apples to apples. And sometimes people draw comparisons when they're not actually very legitimate. And that's where it's sort of able to say, well, yeah, I get it, but like, how many years ago were you doing this? So if it was 20 years ago, I'm not sure the salaries, like, there's this thing called inflation, and So I think in part that's the piece of the preparation, being able to push back a little and say, yeah, I hear you, and things have changed, and that's why I'm raising some of these other things.
Can everyone, I need you to hold that question. Can everyone join me in thanking Dr. Weiss?